Hello, everyone. My name is Nadim Houri. I'll be your moderator today. We'll just give a couple of minutes for people to come in. صباح الخير جميعا. في ترجمة حيكون الويبينار باللغة الإنجليزية، بس في ترجمة مباشرة، بس فيكم تكبسوا على الانتربريتيشن يلي لكم على الزوم، بتروحوا على المور وهونيك في الانتربريتيشن من الإنجليزي للغة العربية. I think we will get started. All right. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. For those of you joining us from the Middle East, my name is Nadim Houri. I'm the Executive Director of the Arab Reform Initiative. And it's my honor and privilege to be moderating today's webinar on an important, challenging, and very timely issue, which is what rising sectarian violence means for Syria's future. The webinar is part of our broader series of discussions around Syria's transition. And I'm honored to be joined by three fantastic panelists. Jilnar Ahmed, who is a civil society expert and consultant, currently working as the Syrian Archive Program Manager at Mnemonic, an organization that has done fantastic work documenting and preserving human rights-related open source material. She has a long experience working in civil society and NGOs in Syria. But also Sarah Hneidi, who's a Syrian writer, advocate, and member of the Syrian Women's Political Movement. Her work has appeared in various platforms and outlets, from the New York Times to the New Arab and everything in between. In addition to her sort of commentary, she also works as a consultant, and she's been working with local and international organizations on communications and advocacy strategies. And last but not least, my colleague Hayat Hayed, who's a non-resident senior fellow for Syria at the Arab Reform Initiative. He's also a columnist and is a consulting research fellow at Chatham House's MENA program, and has been working on Syria for a very long time. So very rich panel to really help us unpack and explore what is often quite an explosive topic. Now, maybe just by very quick introductory remarks, look, I think sectarian divisions in the Middle East are often portrayed as somehow ancient or indigenous to society. And I think the scholarship, and this is by now well established, from Lebanon to Iraq and to Syria, has shown that sectarianism is actually very much a modern phenomenon, frequently exacerbated by political actors to serve specific agendas, but also by very specific economic choices, economic models, and ways by which rulers have pushed to organize societies. You could argue that both these dynamics, this sort of legacy of sectarian divisions in societies, but also sectarianism as a key modern phenomenon of political organization and control, we see both these dynamics, legacies in the Syrian context. Talk about how the Ottoman millet system or the French colonial divide and rule policies set the stage for some of the relations between minorities, majorities, organization of political life in Syria. But also clearly, and this has been a lot written about, how the Assad regime's divide terrain policies, where under the guise of speaking a language of pan-Arab unity, there were actually policies to, there were policies that reinforce certain sectarian dynamics in society. That doesn't mean, and I think today's discussion will show that we should avoid simplification, that the Assad regime was never a sectarian Alawite regime. People tend to forget this today, that actually there were key pillars. The regime lasted that long because it was an alliance that brought into play key merchant classes from the big cities, Damascus, Aleppo, and other places, but also particularly perhaps the Ba'ath under Hafiz al-Assad had really brought into the governance system marginalized Sunnis from certain areas, including Idlib and others. And it's maybe perhaps the fact that the Sun abandoned some of these alliances that weakened his role at one point. So the way the webinar will go, we'll have 3 rounds of questions that we'll ask to the speakers, and then we'll open it up to the conversation. Maybe the first question to just get us started, if we're talking about sectarianism as a phenomenon that is exacerbated by political actors. So let's start by looking at what I'm going to call the sectarianism from above, basically the sectarianism that is driven through elite and political manipulation, versus what we'll talk about a bit later, the sectarianism from below, the sort of grassroots identity or fear that exists in all societies. But if we're talking about the sectarianism from above, and we could the French colonial divide and rule, the Assad regime's divide to reign was sort of trying to play off fears. What do the new rulers of Syria post-December, how have they approached this question, be it in discourse or in policies? Can we say that they have a minorities policy, or do they have an Alawite or a Druze policy? Maybe I'll start my question to Jalnar Ahmed, if you want to get us maybe started to see, based on your visits and your own work, how you're seeing the approach of the new rulers, how they're framing these issues.
Thank you very much, Nadim, and thank you for Arab Reforms Initiative for organizing this session, and for everyone who joined here. My pleasure is to be participating in this discussion. So to start with this question, with the approach, I would say that mainly, or the main theme that I would drag out is what I would call the dissonance between what we are seeing as an official narrative, the official policy rhetoric of the authorities, and what we are seeing as practices. So I want to go back a little bit in time into late November, and during when the operation Red Ridwan started, and there was, at least amongst minority communities, and specifically amongst the Alawites, there was this massive fear of what will happen next. We're waiting until what will happen when the forces reach the Alawite communities. And then the rhetoric that came with it, which was more, let's say, moderate or contaminated, like just contented and regulated than what has been expected or feared. And that in itself created some kind of dampening the fears, but at the same time, the anticipation was still there. Is that are the fears that we have of the massacre, of the vengeance, of the revenge, are these real? Are these just delayed, or are we avoiding them? And the main rhetoric that was and still continues today is a rhetoric of national unity, that we are all Syrians, focusing on citizenship as Syrians, that we don't have any sectarian or ethnic or regional divisions, and the goal is to build a new Syria for all the citizens, despite the different identity-based rhetorics. And this rhetoric remained the same. However, looking into practices that are not official policy, it is something that paints a very different picture. So from the first weeks within December, it was clear that there was this direct, for example, exclusion of minority figures, and especially Alawites, from any possible decision-making authorities. Part of it came as like a mass exclusion, so for example, like from military service, and that comes with the dissolution of the security services and the army, but also the massive layoff of the public sector. And this is something we can probably go back into a little bit more on, how the different over-representation in some of the sectors of some, like whether the public sector or the security and armed forces of specific minority groups, and especially among I'm talking about the Alawites. And this dissonance between what we have been seeing as a rhetoric of that we will not care about the identity background. It's not about sectarianism. We are working on a country for all Syrians, but the practices was starting of this exclusion that fed into making these fears more, and that what led later when we're talking about after March. So March, of course, was the high point during the 6th and the 11th of March, with the high violence and massacres that took place in the coast. But that was not the only place, because since December there were still cases of violations, specifically amongst minority in the coast and in areas where we had like more closed mixed areas, like for example in Homs, and it was always brushed off as this is just individual cases or things that are so not given the attention that people felt that this is needed, and that in itself created another level of this fear and grievances, which is something that we can probably go deeper into later. For now, I will stop here and hand it over back to you, Nadim.
Great. No, thank you very much. And you really got us started, I think, in the heart of the matter, highlighting three things. I mean, one, this idea of dissonance. I think it's very important when we think about the dissonance between, and what you're saying, I'm hearing three things, right? One is the issue of it's rhetoric as national unity, right? Which, by the way, the Assad regime also used to say, Shab al-Suri wahad. I mean, this didn't actually go very far, but so very present, this idea. But two, a form of what you seem to say, it's the exclusion of decision making, and is it just here, is it omission or it's a deliberate policy of exclusion? And what you're saying, clearly, they didn't come out and say, we're gonna fire all the Alawites, but in practice, by firing people who were in the security forces, in the teaching positions, so forth, it had a disproportionate impact. So maybe there's something there about a form of exclusion as a form of policy. But three, and I will come back to it later, is a pillar of policy, which is by denying that there's an issue, by almost ignoring the violence that people have been experiencing, it's a form of policy because people are experiencing that. And it's sort of this, it's just saying we don't have a problem when actually people are saying, but we're feeling that we have a problem because we're being attacked. But that, I want to move to you, maybe, Sarah, to give us your take about what you see the approach, and maybe if we, in March there were the terrible massacres on the coast, but then shortly thereafter we saw how the Druze community came under attack. By now there was this voice note that was probably fake news that was ascribed to a Druze sheikh, and it just sort of spread like wildfire. And what's interesting is that not only that there was violence in the immediate, but we saw repercussions on Druze students in universities, displacement, but also a popular rhetoric of the Druze are like a fifth column, and they want to separate and so forth. How do you see the approach, the governance, the framing by the authorities since December from your perspective?
Thank you, Nadim. Well, I believe that the Syrian interim government has made, unfortunately, only token gestures towards addressing sectarianism. And for example, when asked how they were countering rising sectarian tensions after incidents like Sahnaya attack, they usually respond vaguely or citing like a video they published where an imam or like someone who, would give a uniting, like they would rely back on the uniting rhetoric. But it's not enough. But this kind of response is perceived, by a lot of people as dismissive and deeply insufficient, given the gravity of the sectarian, fragmentation on the ground. But most importantly, there has been no serious national dialogue or inclusive political effort to engage with the complexity of Syria's fractured society. This kind of indicates that, unfortunately, that, it indicates from people who are deeply now in mistrust with the interim government, that they have unfortunately, the interim government have failed to go beyond symbolic acts and service level media campaigns. So that, like, these sectarianism that we're talking about is going kind of unstopped. We see social media that has no regulations, from Meta as a company that already has now less regulations in the United States, that's also affecting Syria, to Syria as, an interim government that's being built with this neglect on creating rapid response to the current sectarian incidents that are causing people's lives. And the heartbreaking thing about these incidents, in the coast and in Sweden, for example, in a village that's called Sawara, everyone in that village became displaced after they would say, like, these factions that are kind of out of control, they would call them kharijin an al-qanun, even though they are still under the or recently joined the al-amn al-aam, or the official forces of the interim government. The heartbreaking thing about these incidents is that they happened after the fall of the Assad regime. And, I would take this moment to just kind of reflect on how sad it is that we still, we are left with this horrible remnant of decades of sectarian policies, whether, like you said, is it deliberate? Is it not? Well, we know, at least from the Assad regime, that it was deliberate. We have yet to see, even though we have 6 months under our belt, but we have yet to see if the interim government is deliberately excluding people, or is it just acting, because every time, is it acting out of mistrust and fear that they still don't have grab over power and they're scared to share power? That's not an excuse whatsoever, but I hear that a lot, of like, now it is time to rebuild and we can only do it with people who we trust. We can only do it with people who we know. And it is like, it's shown as, for example, using or giving a lot of high position from a certain area. It's usually Idlib, or a certain background. It's usually Tahrir al-Sham. But now when you're building, a country and you're using this unifying rhetoric, you need to back it up with actual, policies, with sharing of power. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that as much as exactly as what Jelnar said. Is this unfortunately, the more time is passing, the first couple of months we kept saying, like, let's give them a chance, but the more time is passing and we still need to give them a chance, I'm still, like, leaving this, hope that this interim moment, is 5 years long. But if it is being used to solidify another rule, an exclusionary rule, then it is kind of time to hold, to press the alarm button and say, well, how can we make sure that we actually see pluralism on the ground? And we can only do that, again, using laws and controlling, the media, not controlling the media in a way that, to spread propaganda like the Assad regime used to do, but there must be strong media presence to counter sectarian narratives. The media needs to be used very deliberately. The social media we need to lobby for social media to kind of help building Syria's unity, the way social media helped us plan and organize, in the beginning in 2011. Without social media, I don't think the Arab Spring, we could have, made it happen the way it happened. So we need to also strengthen civil institutions, and we need to have a serious national dialogue, not the joke that happened like for 2 days. So I don't know. It's very worrying is what I'm trying to say, and we have a lot of work to do.
No, thank you very much. And I think you've the issue of mistrust and fear as an animating factor, both, I think, from what Jannar and you have said, both for minorities, but also potentially for people in power, and that how can reinforce the sort of sectarianism as a policy. There also, I think, what you mentioned as well, the issue of symbolic acts, and I want to come back to it a bit later, and obviously we're going to spend some time talking about what the future looks like. The issue of symbolic acts and the issue of narrative. I mean, you're someone who also works a lot on communication, is what is the narrative and how do you give meaning to a narrative to say Shab al-Suri Wahad? And as a Lebanese watching Syria, and I've worked on Syria now for almost 2 decades, it's actually been interesting. Some of the images coming out of Syria remind me of the stereotypical photos that we start seeing from Lebanon. So the issue of how we counter sectarianism, we get the sheikh and the priest, and we put them in one photo, and that's it, you know. But that's a very, in my view, shallow way of addressing. And but maybe that points to something, and I want to get to hide on that maybe one of the challenges about the mistrust and the fear is what exists at the Syrian level, at the meso level, in terms of trust building institutions, in terms of moral authority. Because one thing that's been, I mean, when we saw these peaks of violence, in March against Alawites, later against Druze, who in society today has the authority, the capacity to step in? I mean, if it doesn't have to go all the way to Ahmad al-Shami, people who would sort of step in and to kind of organize it or to present an alternative narrative to overcome this fear. Where do you see that? And is the legacy perhaps of the Assad regime is that you don't have these, there's such a low level of trust that there are very few institutions able to do that. I mean, Hayed, you've been looking and thinking a lot about governance at the local level. Can that fill some of those gaps? How are you seeing the policies, not just from the government, but also from all the different local authorities, the governors, the Lijan al-Mahaliyya? How is their approach to managing diversity and to notions of sectarianism in Syria?
Thank you, Nadim. I think just before answering that question, it'll be good to briefly give just quick overview of how those structures actually emerged after the fall of the regime, because while the transitional government has been trying to centralize its sort of authority or impose its central authority over the country as a whole, they have not had the capacity, resources, or even time to really do that at the local level. So what they have done is they have brokered some sort of temporary arrangements with local notables in different areas that would allow them to nominate people to temporarily run the areas under the sort of authority of the governor and then the central government. So because of that, you have now local individuals who are in a position to somewhat provide services, but they don't really have the resources or even the authority to mobilize the people, the residents in their areas, and more importantly, coordinate effectively with the central government and with security forces or even military forces in their areas or in the wider regions where they live. And because of that, you have fractured attempts by different people in different areas in order to usually contain and extinguish fires after they take place, rather than working really proactively on preventing them from happening. So usually, for example, if we talk about what happened in Jaramana or Sahnaya, usually what happens is that you have people attacking from the outside or incidents happening in the area, and then notables come from different, usually ethnic or religious backgrounds in coordination with the local authorities, mostly security forces here, and then try to find a way to basically calm everything down, de-escalate the situation. And their efforts usually end there, because for them, For as long as the situation does not escalate, it's a win. Now, knowing that they have competing priorities and they're working on other issues, then at the end, they don't really have the bandwidth to follow up and make sure that the issues that, or the drivers that fuel those conflicts are addressed properly, and they to prevent them from fueling other sort of episodes of violence in the future. And because of that, what you are left with is usually just isolated efforts and initiatives by local notables, mostly by local civil society groups, but they don't have the resource or the backing of the authorities in order to really go beyond just extinguishing those fires. And I think what's needed, especially in those cases, is some sort of strategy or efforts that go beyond those small localities, because most of the problems we are talking about are not basically caused by drivers in those localities. For example, in Sahnaya, the incidents, or even Jaramana, was what happened there is that people from outside Sahnaya, outside Jaramana, attack residents in those areas. If you talk about the coastal areas, you have people from outside that region went there and committed violations because there were incidents that were basically the security forces ambushed, people were killed, and all of that for sure. There were triggers that led people to go there. But what I'm saying is that it's not limited to those specific areas. So what's needed goes way beyond just small initiatives at the local level. What we need is something bigger at the national level to address those issues, because those are national issues, they are not local issues. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayed. So before I move to talk a bit about sectarianism from the sort of bottom, what we're seeing at the level of the societal interactions, but I do want to just drill maybe on this issue of sectarianism from the top. We're talking about, okay, mistrust, perhaps dissonance between rhetoric and practice. But if we look at now the last 5-6 months of decision making, are we seeing any inclusive practices beyond the sort of, we're going to appoint one person from this minority, one person from this minority? Do we get a sense of what's happening at the level of appointments in the security forces today? Is there an attempt? And on the issue of mistrust, just to put out the sort of the blunt question out there, is it just simply mistrust? Because there are a lot of key opposition people to the old regime that came from these minorities, right? But we haven't seen any of them really be brought forward. So is there something more? I guess what I'm trying to say is there a new majoritarian context in Syria that's part of the new ruling philosophy to say, this is now the time for a clear Arab Sunni majority to rule Syria. We will tolerate the minorities, but as long as they realize they're only minorities and they accept, not necessarily from if I use their logic, second degree, but key decision making will not be in your arms, but we're happy to allow you on personal status laws, maybe on certain. Is this what we're seeing emerge from sort of from the top as a key policy? Do you see evidence of that? Am I being unfair by describing it as such? I don't know. I don't want to necessarily go all around, but if one of you would like to comment on this, just unmute and jump in. And then I want to move to talk a bit more about what we're seeing at I would say, the popular level of mistrust as well, and how that is taking shape.
So I would jump in for a quick point on this. Still talking from the top down level, if you want to say, or the official rhetoric. I think what you described, Nadim, is something that I would see personally as a big part of the. I would see the reality of how the rhetoric is being shaped on the top level. While it is not always existent, but we have seen a lot of this checking the vibe policy from the authorities in general, by saying something here, saying something there, and see how and adapt according to the to how the reaction to that is, and specifically when we are talking about an international audience. So also another level of this dissonance on how these topics are approached when it is about international audiences, when it is about gaining international support or regional support, or when it is generally addressing the Syrian people. So one of the main impressions or things that were talked about, that there was basically no direct discussion or no direct talking to Syrians until late in January, which was 2 months later. But we were at that time seeing a lot, for example, for interviews with international media, etc. But going back into this notion of majoritarian authority or rule, it was something that was, for example, expressed one time explicitly by the foreign minister, by Asad Shibani, who said that we have been living for a long time under minority rule, and now it is the time to reverse that. So that was something that was once at least explicitly said from someone on the top high level. However, I want to just come back to another point quickly when we are still discussing the top-down approach to sectarianism. I think, Sarah, you mentioned the lack of actual participation in national dialogue and inclusive policies. And I would add also to that the delay and the lack of clear justice frameworks and procedures, because that in itself is fueling revenge. Since day one, we have been hearing the rhetoric, mainly from the authorities, that we want a transitional justice, not a revenge justice or a selective justice. But that was also the rhetoric. And that meantime, there was no actual practices that that probably will bring us later to the second point. We're talking about the grassroots or the popular level, but that also did not provide any type of safety or of assurances to people that their rights will be preserved. So the incidences that took place, mainly in Homs and Hama, so in mixed sectarian areas in December and January, were basically fueled because people felt that they have to take their justice by their own. And it was in those mixed areas because this is where the tension was the highest, because it was neighboring neighborhoods or neighboring villages that actually had history of violations against each other. And there was this feeling that no one is going to bring us justice. No one is going to give us our rights. So we have to take it in our hands. And at the same time, those incidences were always labeled as, again, individual, brushing them off, and that, no, we are still a one community, and these are a group of lawless, either groups or lawless individuals. But in the core of it, it is because there is no sense of justice for a lot of communities who suffered over the last 14 years and over the last 54 years. And until now, the delay of application of a clear framework for transitional justice is also fueling those tensions. And the current approach now with the new commission, by limiting its scope into just crimes committed by the Assad regime, I think it's also alarming and might lead to another cases of vengeance where people will feel that there is no addressing of their actual fear and grievances.
Just if I may just quickly add to that, I think while acknowledging that it has only been 6 months and you cannot expect the whole sort of all the legacies caused by conflict, by sectarian regime for 40 years or even more to be addressed quickly over this short period of time. I think that the main problem right now for many people is that they cannot see how the ticking the box approach will change in the near future or even in the mid term. And what we have seen is a continuous sort of deployment of the same approach over and over. You look at the national dialogue, you look at the constitutional declaration, you look at even the transitional justice sort of commission and others. And I think while we are talking here about mostly religious sort of minorities, if you basically take a step back and talk about minorities in broader terms, you will talk about people who are even from the Sunni community who don't agree with this approach. So you have political minorities, you have people who are basically belong to different minorities, even women, although they basically, based on percentage, they are not a minority in Syria. You talk about at least half of the population. They are still addressed and dealt with as a minority, and their inclusion is not even guaranteed. So because of all of that, you have, I think that the problem is not with the short period of time that, or what has been implemented in this short period of time, but basically lack of clarity on how the government, the transitional government, will change the way it's approaching those issues is the real risk here. I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nar and Haid. And I think the issue as well, it's important to remember that this is not just about minorities, right? And that this is that who actually says that the Sunnis in Syria are a unified bloc, whereas actually historically they never were. I mean, even under the old regime, there were Sunnis who allied themselves and supported the regime versus others who didn't. There were some who benefited from Ba'ath economic policies in the 70s and 80s, others who were on the losing end. And I think this bringing back this sort of complexity. But what I take from that first round of questions, and it seems all three of you agree, is that there's a sense of a rhetoric that talks a bit about national unity. You know, it's not saying we Ummat Muhammad. You know, they're not coming out explicitly and saying we only speak for this, but that actually there's a dissonance between some of this rhetoric and the policies, either through policies by omission, by inattention, or by exclusion. But one thing is clear, that there is no emerging narrative from top, projects from top where people find themselves. And I think the point of that is that even when it comes now that they're starting to address this issue of transitional justice by trying to create this commission, it's actually not going to create a unifying framework, because some victims are going to be excluded in the process as well. So I want to take that as a segue to talk a bit about, you know, maybe I guess exploring how today sectarianism is experienced and expressed in Syria on the ground. I guess we could call it, you know, the sectarianism from below. But also perhaps how it's being resisted in society and in that. And, you know, I'll start with you, Sarah. I mean, one thing that as well for me was striking when we saw the violence against Druze spread like wildfire. You know, we talked about the role of social media and magnifying, but it sort of found relays, you know, and suddenly to the extent, and we all know the problems with social media these days, but to the extent that there was sort of there was a mob mentality very quickly on social media. People were posting things very, very quickly in provinces far, far and away from, you know, what maybe would have been a local incident suddenly became this sort of national phenomenon and with very real implications. Druze students had to actually leave their dorms and escape, which actually in images, frankly, that were sad, remind me of the early days of the revolution, where people, you know, Kurdish students and other students had to leave the dorms in Aleppo University or Idlib students because they were fearing arrest. So I guess that I want to start by hearing from you. How is these things being felt today on the ground by people? You know, have the students gone back, or is something broken at this point at the university students, or is something broken? Is the level of, are we seeing new community boundaries being drawn? And maybe, we all know they were drawn as well, partly during the conflict of the 11 years, you know, knowing which neighborhood to go to or which one you don't. But how is that expressing itself? And maybe, you know, while you're addressing this, if there are interesting examples of, I'm going to call it, for lack of a better word, cross-sectarian solidarity or forms of resistance to sectarianism that you saw in these episodes, Can you tell us a bit about them? Example, of maybe students protecting fellow students, professors stepping up, dean. I mean, did we see, these stories where are they? And just to tell people, and I've seen some of you have started using the Q&A function, please write your questions, and we will come to them, as well. And those of you who are watching us on Facebook, you can write a commentary, and one of my colleagues will send them to us on the Q&A and Zoom. But Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is a moment of fear right now. After the joy experience in the first couple of months, I'm going to focus mostly on Syria's south and how the society in Sueda, or whatever my observations of how they're dealing with sectarianism. Unfortunately, right now we see sectarianism today is isolating Sueda and seeks to turn it into a prison. People feel like, they can no longer. My brother wanted to go watch, for example, last week he wanted to go watch a comedy show in Damascus. He was so excited last month, and now he can no longer go to Damascus. He's scared that if someone sees his car that has Sueda on it, he just doesn't feel safe anymore to even leave Sueda. And it also, we see sectarianism depriving students of their right to education, like you mentioned, but not only to go to other, universities in other provinces. We also see that people are scared to send their children to primary and secondary and high school exams this month. A lot of us, like, for example, I lived in a town and I went to Sueda, the city, when I went to high school. So a lot of people actually in Sueda travel to go to school already. So it's just these fears that comes, from sectarian violence and sectarian fear, and internal, unfortunately, kind of sectarianism is showing itself inside Sueda as different factions who belong to different sheikhs and different beliefs. And like you said, like the Sunnis are not, a monolithic group. The Druze also are not a monolithic group, and they have also internal conflicts and internal, and different allegiance. That being said, we see that, thank God, women are stepping up. Like today, I have people and friends that I deeply respect who are on a visit to Daraa. And they're trying to, keep the relationship between Daraa and Sueda on a level that they've always known, which is, filled with solidarity and brotherhood and sisterhood and mutual, respect. So we see these initiatives emerging as a response. They are grassroots initiatives. We don't see a lot of, governmental initiatives to mend the rift that is caused by these incidents, whether it is, a viral voice note or otherwise. We also see a lot of kind of tahween, like when it comes to Israel, because Israel is using every chance it gets to meddle in Syria's politics, using and treating the Druze as kind of another part of the Druze in Israel, and not really minding the fact that Syrian Druze, have a different kind of experience. And this public rhetoric used by Israel is also working on the public narrative in Syria, and is also helping to isolate Syrian Druze and Sueda in particular. But we also see, in response to that, civil society in Sueda, we see a lot of sheikhs and like bashas, or like different leadership rising to mend this rift. Do I think it's working? Unfortunately, when the voice of rational thought and And solidarity sometimes is not as loud as the voice of division and hatred. So that's the unfortunate thing, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't, like, these grassroots movements don't exist. They actually are working, night and day to try to stand up to the rhetoric that is isolating different minorities from feeling like they're part of the one Syria. That being said, like you mentioned, like Syria is one as a slogan that we used also within the Syrian revolution in many of the chants. This is something that, we aspire to be. Right now, a lot of people don't feel like we're one. And maybe if I even, I tell myself this to be less dreamy about my expectations of Syria, because maybe it's more realistic to expect, what happened and the divisions that we're having right now, because we've never had the chance to, practice politics and learn the difference, for example, between democracy and the rule of the majority, between what it means to actually be part of a country that, respects you. So we're trying to build that, but we're kind of every single day I change my mind if we're on the right path towards that or not, because of these incidents that keep, isolating many people from participating in building the future of their country.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Maybe, Jannar, the question goes to you. I think Sarah highlighted a number of key dynamics. I mean, one, in a way, the notion, and we've seen that in other countries, sectarianism as well, acting as a prison. It starts becoming a shield for certain minorities as they protect themselves, but you become imprisoned. You cannot go to the big city, watch a comedy show because you're afraid, but also because suddenly your car plate becomes an issue. Sarah as well talked about, and again, something that I think we've seen in other contexts, women as a way, the restitching societal links, women as peacemakers on a sort of on the ground with different grassroots initiatives. The negative role of external powers, in the case of the Druze, clearly Israel trying to, frankly, Israel has stated very much as a clear policy that a way of destabilizing and weakening Syria is to kind of use the and to exacerbate tensions and that. What are you seeing in the Alawite community? How is that being, given the terrible massacres, but also, the fact that what doesn't often get talked about is that the regime also instrumentalized and exploited the old regime. I'm talking about the Assad regime, exploited the Alawite community so it promoted some, it used some, and in the process, from what I've seen and read, destroyed quite a few of the representatives of the community. So how is that today? I guess now it's been 2 months since the massacres have taken place. We still have Alawite refugees who escaped to Lebanon. We still have people who are displaced from their homes. The investigation that was launched by the authorities has been extended now. I guess there's another month and a half to go till we see the results. How is that being experienced on the ground day to day? And are people also living as a form of prison at this stage? And are there any initiatives that we should highlight that are trying to restitch ties across communities?
Okay, so I think there are a lot of common dynamics looking at them, and starting with this imprisonment or seclusion, I would say it is the most prominent one. So the main, even 2 months on, the main situation or the main feeling you can have is fear. Whenever you talk to anyone, listen to the news, everyone just is fearful, even if it was in calm areas or in areas that currently there is no more incidents happening. And with that, we need always to highlight that the violence and sectarian-based other incidences did not stop after March 11, but March 6 to 11 was the peak of it. So it is less and less frequent, but it is still happening sometimes. And that's in itself establishing this fear more. So fear is the main dominator currently, talking in that mainly in the coast or the Alawites community in general. This lack of mobility, this chosen lack of mobility, that I will stay in my house as long as I can. I go out only for necessary things. I communicate with other people only as necessary because I don't know where the danger is coming from. This is the main message you could hear from anyone in the region. Of course, there is the displaced in Lebanon, but also within the coast itself, there are still a lot of people who did not return back to their own villages or their own homes. I would name at least two main reasons for that. So some of them is basically direct reason because in the villages or communities that were looted and burned. So basically they have nowhere specific to go back to. But in other areas, it is also fueled by fear because some of the groups of them, like armed factions, are still in those locations. So people are still kind of afraid that those are not being controlled enough and we don't want to go back. So there is still a lot of IDPs within the coast in different areas, in different regions, in addition to those in Lebanon. I know in the last couple of months, at least from personal relationships, from relatives and friends and contacts, people who were not thinking about leaving Syria in the last couple of months now would say that on the first chance to travel, I am leaving Syria because I fear my life for later. Cities become almost empty and deserted at night because no one, apologies for the background noise if it is coming through, I cannot control that. Okay, very good. So there is cities feel deserted, like a city like Tartus, for example. Usually in the summer, in the night, people go out because it's hot, they go to the beach, the promenade, but currently this is something that's controlled to be very much risky, and I would prefer to stay inside. So these dynamics are also present. But the main thing is that there is no clarity on where things are going. So for the investigation committee, it has been delayed, but still there was at the beginning the promise or the decision that there will be periodic updates, but the committee later decided that they will not be giving updates. So no one really knows where things are going with the investigation. And in general, I would say that there is a lack of trust, but waiting, let's see what will happen with this. At the same time, if we remember, there was another committee that was basically tasked with peacekeeping or peace building, but it is rarely brought up. It's rarely discussed. It feels again like this checkbox approach that, okay, we formed the committee, although two people on this committee, one of them was known for his sectarian rhetoric against Alawites for years, and the other one was at one point close advisor to Bashar al-Assad. So from the beginning, everyone was skeptical about this committee, and then later we don't hear much about them. What's alarming more is that I would say, especially for things related to solidarity, is the self-censoring among a lot of activists and a lot of people who are feeling the solidarity, but still they are afraid of the backlash because there is a lot of hate speech against anyone who speaks against violations committed. And the label of being a remnant of the regime is very easy, even if someone had years of history, for example, of opposition or activism. But this label is leading to a lot of self-censoring within the activist community. This is something that we have been seeing that a lot, even when it goes to relief organizations, that no, we will not do a campaign of relief in the coast because we don't now want to be labeled as we are supporters of the regime. And one of the main sentences or questions that's going a lot, like, where have you been over those years? Because if at one point there was a kind of solidarity, especially with Alawites. It is always labeled that, okay, you have been supporters with the regime all the time, and you have never spoken against the crimes that were committed by the regime, and mainly against Sunni communities. So even if we want to go back, we cannot. So talking about the weaponization, definitely the regime weaponized the Alawite community, not only by internally within the Alawites and how he addressed them and the whole context of it by depriving their areas of any economic development opportunities and basically leaving the livelihood and high reliance and dependency on the public sector or security and armed forces. But also we all know about many incidences and stories and basically like repeated patterns of people being detained or arrested or tortured or disappeared just because they come from a Sunni majority area or from a revolution area. So the regime have used this as a two-way sword, talking to the Alawites as I am your only protector and controlling them mainly through their livelihood, and on the other side directing the violence in a very apparent way, in very clear patterns against Sunni communities in a way so it can be, the whole blame is to frame it as a sectarian conflict, despite as it was mentioned earlier, the regime was kept alive for 5 decades because of cross-sectarian supporters. So we know the main supporters, the main cronies, the high-level military or officials were diverse from all communities. So I think all those dynamics and context, like whether historical or new emerging, are forming together this very, very complicated picture, which makes addressing it in the lack of a comprehensive government policy to it, it makes it fall back into smaller initiative that is more on a patchwork level that will not be sufficient to actually bridge the rifts or heal those wounds that have been widened over years of oppressions and violence.
Thank you, Jannah. And maybe moving to you, Hayed, I mean, just to add, there was a question from one of the entities, from Petra. What about the role of the diaspora in how it either fuels, contains this issue around sectarian violence? I mean, in this case, Petra from the Netherlands, she's saying we're seeing Syrians demonstrating with hashtag Alawite diaspora, so, and we've seen that in many other contexts, right, where actually the diaspora is sometimes even, their identity becomes even more fixed, or they can articulate it in a way that's narrower. But are we seeing any example of Syrian diaspora is it throwing fuel to the fire? Is it trying, to actually contain? And I think going back to Sarah, I mean, in a way, the virtual public space today in Syria, it's all interactive, right? I mean, there could be someone who's sitting 3 kilometers from Jaramana inciting to violence, or they might be sitting in California inciting to violence, and they might be having, the same effect on people on the ground. So I'd love to hear from you, Hayed, on this issue of the role of diaspora. Again, from this lens of the sectarianism from below, who's feeding it, and who's trying to move it to somewhere else. And one of the questions that came up, and I think this idea of, to go back to this issue of trust building, and we started touching upon it, but maybe if you can go a bit deeper, in terms of the security arrangements on the ground, I mean, how are people seeing and trusting local security forces? I mean, everyone, for a while there was this talk between, Al-Amn al-Aam, general security, yes, perhaps we trust them, but there are these disorderly members of militias that come. Then the people say, actually, no, they're members of Amn al-Aam who were part of the ones who attacked us. So where does that trust lie today? We know, for instance, that there were some negotiations that persuade the local policing will remain from local forces. Is that a short-term approach? I know it's something that the current transitional authorities in Damascus are resisting when it comes to Alawite areas, at least in the coastal areas. They don't want to talk about it. There's a very low trust of who those forces could be. But yeah, maybe I'd love to hear your thoughts about these two dynamics, and if there's anything else you want to add to Sarah and Jalnar about the, on sort of sectarianism from below.
Thank you. Well, first of all, talking about the diaspora as one community, I think would be difficult. As you know, the Syrian diaspora communities, even if we talk, for example, I'm based in the UK, if we talk about the Syrian diaspora in the UK, people really don't know one another. They hardly meet because of the day-to-day sort of issues. But based on sort of observing how people I know in the diaspora have reacted to those incidents, at least on social media, I've seen two different levels. One or two different sorts of approaches. One approach that is basically trying to find common bridges and then trying to connect with others in order to find ways to de-escalate the situation, come up with some sort of initiatives that are supported by those outside, but mainly to in favor of supporting the efforts that were mentioned by Sarah, Jalnar, and others inside. And on the other hand, those who feel directly attacked by those, and they tend to fuel the fire more than they tend to extinguish it. And I think part of the reason for that is that as someone who lives outside, you tend to only know about what's happening from social media. Social media has been weaponized by many to fuel sectarian sort of conflict and incite violence against different sects and communities. And because of that, if you're only an outside watcher who does not really have family there, and because of the way those campaigns start targeting people based on what they read and sometimes where they're from, you might end up being in a situation where you only see one side of the narrative that will push you in a direction that you become part of the problem. And unfortunately, I've seen it with many people I know who have started using the same language that they initially were fighting against. And their main identity, religious identity, has become the main identity because they view it as the one that is currently under attack and needs protection. So they became defenders of it rather than trying to really take a step back and look at the drivers of those issues and how they can be addressed in a more sort of reasonable and holistic way. Now, either way, I think that especially when it comes to those who are trying to find ways, support initiatives to contain the problem, regardless of where you are located right now, I think the impact of those initiatives, which is what I started with earlier, they're quite limited because many of the root causes that are fueling those episodes of violence or violence in general, or sectarianism in general, whether basically on the ground or virtually, are related to aspects that cannot be addressed or contained by an initiative here or initiative there. You need strategy that is more holistic to address those issues, whether it comes to political inclusion, whether it's called to when it comes to addressing past violations, ongoing violations, whether it comes to ensuring the rule of law, and everyone is basically feel that the law is basically there to protect them. All those issues, that whether it goes back to access to fair access to job opportunities and all of that. I'm not going to go into all of those details, but what I'm saying is that despite the existence of initiatives, whether by Syrian diaspora or people who are in there, I think the impact of those cannot be overestimated because the issues are way bigger than what those individual initiatives can achieve. Now, when it comes to the trust towards security forces, personally, to be honest, I went to Syria 3 times so far, and what you started with regard to distinguishing between the general security and other forces, I've heard it personally in Syria from different communities as well. But I think you reach a point where right now, especially if we talk about sectarian tension basically increasing and people in specific areas feeling under attack because the majority of them belong to a specific sect, that's when they reach a point where it's like, at this point, it does not matter whether the general security is better than the armed factions that are basically operating under this the umbrella of the Ministry of Defense, because to them, any outsider is a threat. And this is basically leads me to what you talked about how the transitional authorities are dealing with those communities. So far, because of this, the priority for many communities is to ensure that the security file is managed by people from the same area. They don't want any outsiders because they can only trust people they know. Now, in some areas, the transitional authorities have reach at least temporary solutions to allow locals to manage the security situation under the leadership of Damascus or someone from Damascus. So you talk, for example, about policing. You'll have local police members who are managed by a person appointed by Damascus. You talk about military factions. They operate under the umbrella of the Ministry of Defense, but they stay in their areas and they only basically serve there. And this is the arrangement that we can see in some areas, especially, for example, in Sweden, in Jaramana, even in Christian areas, but unfortunately we don't see in other areas like in the coastal areas. And that also contributes to the distrust and this feeling that basically the standards or double standards of why you're dealing with this minority in a way that is different to us despite being minority and despite being under attack. And now going back to what we started with, for as long as you are basically dealing with different minorities in different ways, and you are not treating everyone equally in practice and in a way that will allow them to feel safe and to allow them to belong, I think we will continue to see those episodes, unfortunately, continuing for the near future, at least.
Thanks, Hayed. And I think this brings me back, this brings us, I think, to the third and last part of the conversation, which I think we started already exploring is, okay, what can be done at this stage and how should we think about addressing sectarianism, these tensions, these fears, and so forth, and what could be the potential successful approaches. And there are a number of questions already, I think, from the audience to that. I mean, I think one of the big questions is, should the goal be to manage pluralism more constructively? You know, I mean, should the goal be at this point to say, actually, Syrians are different. They've gone through different experiences as well. And so part of the governance should be to kind of find a way to, within this unity, to do it. And then the question is, you know, whether it's federalism, expanded decentralization, but this idea that actually you will need to manage Syria a bit differently. There's also, I want to put it out there, which is, you know, and I think and maybe that's been the tension behind this idea of politics of omission in a way, not wanting to address it, because I think there is putting it to you to get your views, because I've heard that from some Syrians say, okay, I mean, what are the risks of ignoring sectarian identity and identities, which is what we're seeing in Syria, versus the risks of formalizing it in political settlements at a particular moment through power sharing, which has been the model in Lebanon and Iraq, which has also shown its limitations. You know, I mean, today there's a lack of trust, so there's an argument probably to be made to say you need some form of power sharing that will make everyone feel a bit more secure. that you formalize. But then if you formalize it, are you in a way freezing these settlements for a very long time? In Lebanon, it's been 30 years. We can't seem to unwind the clock on it. But so just for gain of time, I'd love to kind of maybe do a round if each of you address this issue. Should the goal be to manage pluralism more constructively, and if so, how, in your view? The second one is, so this is more on top, but second question is, what practical steps could local actors, civil society, and transitional authorities take to rebuild trust across sectarian lines? I hear you when you say, Hayed, that these small steps are not going to be enough, but can these small steps be magnified, so they grow? Finally, your maybe concluding thoughts is, are there other models based on your experiences? Or are you curious about other models, that offer, in your view, useful lessons or warnings for Syria? As you think about it, we'd say actually maybe Syria should do a bit more of that or a bit more of this. I'll start with you, Jalnat.
So starting from the beginning, I think what is needed to come out of this dilemma that we are stuck in on what is the aspect. Ignoring sectarianism clearly does not work, because there are deep-rooted issues, grievances that goes back decades, and clearly there is a lot of tension that's coming to the ground, and we are beyond the point of ignoring it, labeling on this very the holistic, the Syrian mosaic approach clearly does not work from our experience over the last 4 or 5 decades. But at the same time, especially the experiences of the two neighboring countries, Iraq and Lebanon, shows us that also an identity-based political system is also not going to work, because it will also recreate those dynamics, and probably into a more violent way. Talking to a lot of people from different backgrounds in Syria, one of the main fears is that we might be going into a kind of division of Syria, even if it's not officially into smaller states, but also into this warlords, identity-based units. But what we are seeing mainly on, I think, is the main issue is this highly centralized, exclusive way of authorities, and this should be the first thing that's going to change from the top up. If we are talking, we definitely need more inclusion, we definitely need more ways for political participation, so it will allow to build political identities, political parties, movement, civil society that is not based on identity, whether sectarian, or if we want to talk also about ethnic, regional, or class divisions. An inclusive way of governments, and including of more some form of decentralization that gives a space for decision making, for power sharing on the local level. Things similar to the experiences that Hayed was mentioning, but those remain now very limited, and in areas where there is at least a certain level of trust. But in a lot of regions in Syria, we are still not seeing that, because the current authorities are still trying to centralize all decision-making powers in their hands. And 2 days ago, there was a lot of the news about, for example, the negotiations with the SDF, and now the new alliance of the Kurdish political parties. And it is not clearly sectarianism as a religious identity thing, but it gives an impression of how the discussions are moving when we are discussing identities and politics in Syria, that there is this high level of concentration of decision-making power, high levels of centralization that does not take the local communities' need. So what we need is a way to bring this bottom-up approach and top-down approach together, and it is a holistic, I would say multi-actor, multi-stakeholder, multi-sector approach. Media definitely plays a huge role on this. I think one of the main things that were fueling a lot of incidences in the violence before is the lack of a clear communication and media strategy by the authorities, whether that is intentional or non-intentional, this is not the point, but still the lack of this, and the spread of rumors, the spread of misinformation, disinformation, the country is living on rumors, whether inside Syria, but also among the diaspora. It is rumors spread like fire, and it is always fueling this tension that then turns out to be baseless, but it leads, we are seeing its manifestation or in violence in real world. The other aspect I talked before about the framework for justice, we definitely need a more inclusive framework of justice that starts by focusing more on reconciliation, on discussions, on dialogue, on a very local grassroots level. And for that, we don't have to start from scratch, because there has been a lot of effort. There is a strong civil society on the grassroots level, and there is a lot of efforts to be built on. But currently, it is all being brushed away and left to be not brought up together in one framework. And this is where I see the role of a transitional justice commission, or in general other commissions formed on the national level, on how to bring these different efforts together, how we can bring those tracks, talking from up-down approaches, but also building up on the bottom up, on the contextualized, nuanced approaches to how to deal with the different aspects of it, how to deal with the economic aspects of it, because at least in the coast and among the Alawites community, this is a huge issue, and it is not just like another secondary factor, but it is one of the main factors fueling the violence, that the economic situation is basically pushing people into despair without any hope that they have any potentials of going forward. Remember, that was, I was in the coast in February, so before the peak of the massacres, and the main thing everyone says, I don't know if I will have a salary next week. I don't have if I have salary next month. So even if now I am still in my job, this might not be stable for later. So there is this lack of clarity on where things are going. Of course, we know it's only 6 months, and it is a huge transition, and the expectations should be managed. But at the same time, it is still too much unpredictable, too much chaos, and too much lack of clarity that is just fueling all those fears, all these grievances, and lack of accountability for them at the same time. So far, we have not seen or heard about any clear, direct accountability measures for those who have committed sectarian-based violence over the last 6 months. It was small news about an arrest here or there, but without any clear framework, and not in a way that will be deterrent for other groups or individuals to actually take similar actions again, because they see that those actions are not being accounted for.
Thank you very much. And no, I wanna, and so, so you're saying, look, we need to think of systems that link up the bottom up to the top down, right? So think about what could these look like in practice, institutions that give the direction from the top, but actually build on what still exists on the ground. Is it forms of decentralization? What form of contextualization that can take? That's, I think, one. You mentioned, I think, the importance of addressing the notion of rumors that are really kind of dominating and keep fearing. And I think here there's a real role, and we've seen it, the fact that there's even evidence, I think the BBC Arabic ran a report that actually a lot of the rumors around and the fake news around when there were attacks on the Druze were actually being sponsored from outside of Syria. So who's behind these massive campaigns of disinformation? You talked about inclusive frameworks of justice and accountability. And I think this is going to be, whoever is it, you're going to have to address the crimes of the past, but also the crimes since December, the crimes that are ongoing. And finally, I think linking it to the notion of there needs to be a sense of economic justice and fairness as well, because otherwise it's going to, it's just going to fear mistrust. So I think, a big, ambitious agenda, but I think, it shows how we have to think of it on multiple layers. Coming to you, Sarah, and I don't know if you're seeing some of the questions as well. I mean, where do you see the opportunities? And I think we're not, we could talk about what it would take to revise the curriculum for the long term and so forth. But I think given the moment we're living in, this moment of transition, I really want us to sort of try to struggle and think through what can be done today and in the coming months to start stitching, the communities back together, to try sort of fighting back these narratives, and maybe where you fall on some of these issues of decentralization, capturing, getting some guarantees, but where do you see the most interesting and most important next steps in trying to tackle this?
Thank you, Nadim. I mean, after everything, I mean, the amazing commentary by Jill Nahr, I just would like to add to that. I think, in terms of practical steps, there could be from the government enacting laws banning hate speech and incitement. Again, we've seen very shy attempts at doing that, but we don't see like clear addressing of hate speech towards anyone who's different, whether it is minorities or even gender minorities, not just and maybe that is ambitious, but just put it out there. Hate speech is, festering in our community, and I will, return to the role of the diaspora, because yes, a lot of the diaspora are playing, unfortunately, a bad role when it comes to inciting violence. But at the same time, this is where I also see the hope. Not just, in the diaspora, but also people who are still there. But going back to what the government can do in terms of practical steps, I think then we need to see more support of inclusive memorialization efforts that recognize all communities suffering, not just focusing on, the majority or Sunni suffering. It's unfortunately has been, because they are the majority, they have, in terms of, if we're talking about numbers, but when we are trying to build a more unifying kind of identity or national identity based on citizenship rather than sect or ethnicity, we have to spend more effort into supporting more inclusive rhetoric. And that is also part of the justice and accountability work, and part of a plan for transitional justice, truth commissions, reparations, local reconciliation efforts, all need to be focusing on, like we said, all human rights violations and all Syrians, including every single community. And this is something where the government is lacking. We also don't see any funding of local peace building initiatives. Syrians in the last 14 years have worked so hard on, whether in the diaspora or inside of Syria, on peace building initiatives, on grassroots movements. We see a lot of research, we see a lot of civil society. We don't see a lot of inclusion in that, or at least the intent. I'd like to see more of that, and especially those led by women and youth. We also, now this is something that's my passion project, and this is so important to me, is the integration of civic education in schools, at least, or in just maybe through initiatives that, these civic education is very much needed after living under authoritarianism for the longest time ever. We have generations of people who, even if they want to build a unified Syria, they don't have the tools to do so. They've never been offered the knowledge. And instead, they've been, offered all of these hateful rhetoric on a silver platter through, social media and the lack of regulations and control of chaotic messaging that just responds to trends and things that, fuel sectarian violence, unfortunately. So I think the antidote to that is a clear plan of civic education initiatives that promote tolerance and shared history. That is really important. That also can include, examples of other kind of contexts that, no context applies 100% to Syria, even Lebanon, even though we're so close, but you know, like power sharing can entrench sectarian elites and stall reform. That's like a lesson from Lebanon, I'm sorry, but it is. And from Iraq as well, you know, the Baathification and exclusion of people or of thirds of the country, talking about the Sunni, exasperated violence as well. In Rwanda, for example, grassroots reconciliation paired with accountability helped rebuild trust. Not perfect again, but we can learn from these lessons. And same with Bosnia, ethnic quotas froze wartime divisions into state structures. We cannot afford to do that in Syria as well. So I think we're all like dancing around the same idea of that there's a lack of a clear framework, and there's always has, like, in the last 6 months, maybe the liberation of Syria came at a surprise, not just to Syrian people, but also to people who are in power today. That still doesn't justify the lack of a strategic political and nationalistic plan that will, you know, hopefully make us arrive at a model that respects everyone. They keep, you know, mentioning what's the Asian country that Singapore as like the model that they want to arrive in, but I don't see, you know, a clear roadmap to getting there. And unfortunately, when I listen to my fears, I see the opposite direction of going to Singapore. But when I look at, you know, the grassroots grassroots movements and peace building projects that are emerging, and they are also building on the work of people who've some, you know, we've lost, but their work still remains. Like, people are doing their own memorialization efforts. You know, I get some hope. So I would say that we have where to get the answer to that is through the kind of lessons learned, and Syrians have already made steps in that. And going back to the diaspora, it's really unfortunate that we had to spread the world with Syrians because we had to leave our country because of the brutality of the Assad regime and fearing for our lives. But also that made us, you know, integrate to other societies and learn and kind of break out from the prison that used to be Syria, where we didn't really interact with the world much. So that could be our strong point into building an inclusive Syria.
Great. No, thank you very much, Sarah. And I, you know, with your emphasis a lot on the notion of inclusive Syria, the notions of inclusive memorialization, you know, you talked about the funding of the local peace initiatives, civic education, so at a broader. So I think, again, what you and Jannah are getting at is we're going to have to think about bottom up, but also top down, and see where these things can meet, because bottom up on its own is not going to scale up fast enough, and top down is not just simply not resonating enough. And maybe this idea of ideation that you're talking about, that maybe that the fall of the regime is, there's going to be a need for a real, almost collective workshop to think about what could be the sort of future Syria. And I think there was one of the questions to that extent, which is, you know, kind of, you know, I can never build from scratch. I think it was the first question from Gamal Mansour, but I think this idea that actually identities can evolve and Syrians can maybe find their way. But I'll conclude with you, Hayat. If you have any sort of parting words, and you know, you work on governance, so you're thinking about decentralization, federalism, and you've worked on other countries. You've lived in Lebanon, you've worked on Iraq. I mean, last words of wisdom in 2-3 minutes about what do you see as a meaningful way to address these tensions and a way rebuild trust and a sense of inclusion from a governance perspective at this stage? What would you like to see happen? Again, not 5 years, not in some ideal democracy, but in Syria in the next few months. What would you like to see happen to be able to address some of these very multi-layered, complex, and dangerous dynamics in the country?
Sure. So I worked on, I lived in Lebanon, worked in Iraq, but I live in the UK. And I think what I'm trying to say here is that Syria is not the only country in the world where you have people from different sects coexist, and trying to live together and all of that. I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel. The main problem here is that when everyone has different identities, and again, when one of those identities come under attack, that becomes your sort of main identity, and then you try to mainly defend the identity. You don't become, you are not yourself. You're not basically thinking about other ways to do it. So a self-defense mechanism as well. So what's needed is, because we know that neither basically sectarian power sharing sort of models or ignoring the issue in general don't work. So you need to address fears. And there are two types of fears that are basically fueling those sort of sectarian issues. Fears from other citizens in the country, so fear from the other on the individual level, community level, and then fears from basically the state and those who are now in the position of power in the state. To be able to basically address the individual fear towards individuals or communities, you need to, again, ensure that, as Sarah mentioned, that there's enough laws and regulations that will prevent people from inciting violence, sort of spreading hate speeches, and most importantly, committing violations. So to be able to hold people accountable in transparent way will be crucial. Having strong and clear security measures in order to A, identify the risks before they happen, and then B, mobilize forces to protect those who could be at risk will be crucial. Only when you do those three levels, people will feel at least somewhat secure when it's done for basically a period of time, and they feel, okay, now we are not under attack. We see someone saying something on Facebook, but it's not impacting us directly, and those people or individuals are dealt with in a manner that is basically clear, transparent, and basically ruled by the law. Now, when it comes to addressing the fears towards the state and those who are in a position of power, that's a more complicated way, because you will have to ensure, again, going back to inclusion in the political process, make sure that the constitution represents those people, represents their diversity, and protect them as well. And then the governance model that is basically imposed on them is not imposed on them, but rather shaped by them, and they are part in making the model. Whether that model is centralized, decentralized, whatever you want to call it, at the end, it has to meet the diversity and aspirations of those individuals. The last bit is related to building trust between communities, and having, basically, Jannar mentioned that earlier, you have three individuals committee that is in charge of building peace building in the whole country. Two of them are mistrusted by the majority of people in that country. How would that work? So you need to establish clear strategies and structures that would actually start allowing people and communities to trust one another, allow them to heal through transitional justice and other means, and allow people to start addressing those issues that for many generations and decades, the people in Syria and the regimes in Syria have been trying to bury down and ignore. Only by acknowledging the problem and start discussing it, you will be able to get closer to addressing, coming up with solutions to it. I'll stop here.
Great. No, thank you very much, Hayed, Sarah, Jannar, for all your contributions. Thank you to the attendees and the questions. It's my fault if we haven't been able to address all of them, but as I mentioned, this is an ongoing series around the transition, and I just want to conclude as well by, I think, something you concluded on, Hayat, is also the importance of time. And I think that's a key lesson from other conflicts, that to address these complex issues of fear, trust, of bad governance, of justice, you actually need time. And it's actually thinking that what is needed right now is to, and I think, Sarah was talking about it, and you as well, you have reduction of violence, people that they start feeling there's actually accountability, that they are protected, they can actually go to watch a show in Damascus and not fear that because of their card plate, they might not be able to make it there safely. And in parallel, that would maybe give some oxygen to imagine new forms of governance and new initiatives. Clearly, a lot to be done, but I think Syria has astonished us multiple times over the years, and I'm actually quite hopeful that we will see it astonish us again in a positive way in the coming period. Thank you very much, and hope to see all of you next time for more conversations around Syria's transition and different moments. And thank you again to our speakers. Ma'as salam, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.